Episode 12, John Wayne Gacy, the killer next door. They called him normal. That was the word people used most often. Normal. Reliable. Friendly. The kind of man you didn't look at twice. The kind of man whose name didn't stay in your head after a handshake. John Wayne Gacy lived in a quiet neighborhood in Illinois. He waved to his neighbors. He hosted barbecues. He volunteered. He wore a smile that felt practiced, but not fake enough to raise suspicion. If you had driven past his house in the mid-1970s, you would have seen nothing unusual. A neat lawn. A flag on the porch. Lights on in the evening. Music sometimes drifting through open windows. It looked like a place where nothing bad could happen. And that was the point. Long before anyone knew what was happening inside that house, young men began to disappear. Not all at once. Not loudly. One here. Another months later. A teenager who didn't come home after a shift. A young man who said he was meeting someone about a job. A son who told his parents he'd be back soon and then never walked through the door again. At first, there was no pattern anyone wanted to see. In the 1970s, missing young men were rarely treated as urgent cases. Especially if they were over 18. Especially if they didn't come from influential families. Police reports were taken. Names were written down. And then, quietly, the assumption settled in. They must have run away. They must have moved on. They must have gotten into trouble somewhere else. John Wayne Gacy understood this better than anyone. He understood trust. He understood desperation. He understood how bad the young men needed work. He offered them jobs. Construction. Remodeling. Cash. No paperwork. No background checks. He knew what to say. He knew how to sound legitimate. He had a business card. He had tools. He had confidence. And confidence is persuasive. Those who met him often remembered the same thing. He was friendly. He was talkative. He made jokes. He asked questions. He listened just enough. He created an atmosphere where saying no felt awkward. Where walking away felt rude. Where staying felt easier. Some accepted rides. Some accepted drinks. Some stepped inside his house believing they would be there only a few minutes. Most never left. Inside that house, beneath the normal surface, Gacy had built something else. A second life. A private system of control. A routine that repeated itself again and again. He learned what worked. He learned how to silence panic. He learned how to erase evidence. And most chilling of all, he learned that no one was looking closely enough to stop him. For years, the disappearances continued. Families filed reports. Mothers called police stations over and over, asking if there had been any updates. Fathers drove through neighborhoods searching for faces they recognized. Brothers and sisters checked shelters, hospitals, morgues. They followed rumors. They followed leads that went nowhere. And the house on Summerdale Avenue stayed quiet. Gacy did not fit the image people expected. He wasn't reclusive. He wasn't visibly unstable. He was involved in local politics. He attended community events. He even performed at parties dressed as a clown, entertaining children. The image was almost absurd. And because it was absurd, people dismissed darker thoughts before they could fully form. No one wants to believe evil can look ordinary. But behind closed doors, Gacy's control was absolute. Survivors later described a routine that began with trust and ended with terror. He would show them a trick. Handcuffs. A joke. A challenge. Once restrained, the tone changed. What followed was violence. Methodical. Rehearsed. Repeated. And afterward, the house returned to normal. The bodies were hidden beneath the floor. In the crawl space. Buried carefully, deliberately. One after another. Over time, the smell became noticeable. But Gacy had explanations. Sewer problems. Damp soil. Old pipes. People accepted those explanations because it was easier than imagining the truth. Years passed. By the late 1970s, the number of missing young men had grown too large to ignore. Patterns began to surface slowly. A few of the missing had last been seen with a man driving a distinctive car. Some had mentioned a construction job. A name appeared more than once in reports. John Wayne Gacy. At first, it meant nothing. Then it meant something. Detectives began asking questions. They spoke to Gacy. He answered calmly. He invited them in. He joked. He cooperated just enough. There was nothing concrete. No bodies. No witnesses willing to testify. Suspicion without proof dissolves quickly. But something about him lingered. Then one disappearance refused to fade. A young man named Robert Pius vanished in December 1978. He had gone to speak with a contractor about a job. He was seen alive shortly before entering Gacy's orbit. This time, there were witnesses. This time, the timeline was tighter. This time, the police did not look away. A search warrant was obtained. What they found did not make sense at first. Items that belonged to missing men. Jewelry. Clothing. Personal effects that had no innocent explanation. And beneath the house, when they began to dig, the truth surfaced in the worst possible way. The crawl space was not empty. As bodies were recovered, one by one, the scale of what had happened became impossible to deny. Each discovery rewrote the past. Each victim was a life that had vanished quietly, while the world moved on above them. John Wayne Gacy was arrested. At first, he denied everything. Then he talked. And talked. And talked. His accounts shifted. Details changed. Numbers fluctuated. The final count would become one of the highest in American history. But even then, there were gaps. Victims who were never identified. Questions that never received answers. Families who learned the truth years too late. And a neighborhood that would never again feel ordinary. The trial would come later. The sentence. The execution. Those are facts people remember. But what matters more is this. For years, the signs were there. The disappearances. The excuses. The silence. And beneath one normal house, an entire history waited to be uncovered. This was not a monster hiding in the shadows. This was a man who lived in plain sight. And no one stopped him. After the first bodies were found, the neighborhood changed overnight. Police cars lined the street. Floodlights illuminated the yard. Reporters stood behind tape, whispering numbers they didn't yet understand. Neighbors watched from windows they had looked through for years without seeing anything unusual. The house became a crime scene. And then it became something worse. A map of failures. As investigators continued digging beneath the floorboards, they realized the truth was not contained to one or two victims. The crawl space extended farther than anyone expected. And it was full. Bodies layered on top of bodies. Some wrapped. Some not. Some buried carefully. Others rushed. It told a story without words. A story of repetition. Of routine. Of escalation. Gacy had not killed in a frenzy. He had killed with planning. Detectives began reconstructing timelines. They cross-referenced missing persons reports. They looked at photographs. Dental records. Clothing descriptions. One by one, identities were attached to remains. Each confirmation brought closure to one family and devastation to another. Parents were called into rooms they never wanted to enter. They were shown items recovered from the house. A ring. A jacket. A belt buckle. Small things that suddenly carried unbearable weight. Some families received answers. Others were left with questions that would never be resolved. And all the while, John Wayne Gacy talked. He spoke freely. Too freely. He described his actions in a detached, almost casual way. As if recounting chores. As if distance could soften what he had done. He shifted blame. He minimized. He exaggerated. Sometimes in the same sentence. He claimed multiple personalities. He claimed memory loss. He claimed responsibility. Then denied parts of it. Psychologists listened carefully. What they heard was not madness. It was control. A man trying to shape the narrative even after capture. The trial revealed details the public was not prepared for. The methods. The repetition. The way victims were lured. The way trust was used as a weapon. The courtroom sat in silence as the evidence was presented. There were no gasps left. Only disbelief that it had taken so long. What haunted many investigators was not just what Gacy had done, but how easily he had done it. He exploited assumptions. That young men could take care of themselves. That adults didn't vanish without reason. That predators looked a certain way. That danger announced itself. He proved all of that wrong. The crawl space beneath the house was eventually sealed. The building was demolished. The address changed. But the ground remained. And so did the memory. People avoided the area. Not out of superstition. Out of understanding. John Wayne Gacy was sentenced to death. Years later, he was executed. Some called it justice. Others called it closure. For many families, it was either. It was simply an ending that came too late. Because the real tragedy was not the final act. It was the years before. The misreports. The dismissed parents. The assumptions that allowed a predator to operate without resistance. Gacy did not hide in darkness. He hid behind normality. And that is why his story still matters. Because even now, decades later, the conditions that allowed him to kill still exist. And sometimes, the most dangerous people are the ones everyone trusts. As the investigation expanded, another truth became impossible to ignore. The number of victims would never be exact. Some remains were too damaged. Some identities were lost to time. Some families would never receive confirmation. Gacy himself seemed unsure. Or unwilling. He spoke of numbers the way other people spoke of years. Casually. Imprecisely. As if lives were interchangeable. That uncertainty became its own form of cruelty. Investigators searched rivers. Forests, construction sites connected to Gacy's business. They followed every lead he mentioned, even the ones that contradicted each other. Some remains were found far from the house. Others were never found at all. Each unanswered question extended the crime beyond the crawl space. Beyond the property line. Beyond what could be neatly closed. What disturbed many detectives most was not just the scale, but the timeline. Gacy had been questioned before. He had been reported before. Complaints had been filed. Names had surfaced. And still, nothing stopped him. The system didn't fail all at once. It failed quietly. Incrementally. One ignored call. One delayed report. One assumption stacked on another. In court, Gacy attempted to manipulate the outcome the same way he had manipulated his victims. He played roles. He shifted expressions. He tried to confuse. When that failed, he leaned into notoriety. He painted. He spoke to the media. He tried to control how he would be remembered. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury returned a guilty verdict on every count. The sentence followed. Death. The public reacted with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that he could no longer hurt anyone. Horror at what had been allowed to happen. Yet even after sentencing, the story did not end. The families were left to rebuild lives interrupted by violence they never saw coming. Some fought to keep their sons' names remembered. Others withdrew. Grief does not follow one path. Justice does not heal evenly. Years later, the house was gone. The street was renamed. New families moved in. Children played nearby. Life returned. But not entirely. There are places that remember even when people try to forget. John Wayne Gacy was executed in 1994. Witnesses described the moment as procedural. Clinical. Final. There was no drama. No spectacle. Just the end of a man whose crimes had already ended years earlier. What remained were questions no execution could answer. Why were the early warnings ignored? Why were missing young men treated as expendable? Why did it take so long for suspicion to turn into action? Those questions reach beyond one case. Because Gacy was not stopped by brilliance or luck. He was stopped because one disappearance did not fade. Because one family refused to accept silence. Because eventually, someone looked again. And that is the most unsettling part. If Robert Piest had not vanished when he did, how many more would have followed? The story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about a killer. It is about what happens when systems assume instead of verify. When comfort outweighs curiosity. When normal is trusted too easily. The crawl space is gone now. But the lesson remains. Evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it volunteers. Sometimes it lives next door. And sometimes it waits for no one to look closely enough.